Good evening. I think it's already approaching the evening, right? Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I'm Maria Perbellini. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture and Design at New York Tech. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the book launch of Autonomous Urbanism Towards a New Transitopia by our own assistant professor, Evan Shieh. Evan's book is focused on autonomous vehicles, AVs, as he's saying, acronyms, as they could represent the next technological disruption to our mobility systems. While long-term spatial implications remain largely underestimated, the book argues that AVs offer a major opportunity to rethink our cities' built environments with a reflection on the possible profound impacts on urban life. Grounded in a discussion of our recent urban transportation history, Evans speculates on a driverless mobility paradigm shift through multiscalar design typologies and transportation policies. They are presented through the unique format of an architectural graphic novel, which is quite unusual and unique. By envisioning a future guided by design and policy actions, the book contends that cities can transition from the utopia of today to the transitopias of tomorrow. But I'm going to stop here because I know Evan has a lot to say about his book, and I would like to ask Evan to join me and start the presentation.
So is there a reason why it's third? So. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Dean Perpellini. I want to extend my gratitude to you, the Dean's Office, the chairs, and the administration for making this event possible. Thank you to Athena, our Lectures and Events Committee Chair, and to Sue for all your coordination efforts. Thank you to my colleague Marcella, who will be moderating. And lastly, thank you for all of you, my colleagues, friends, former and current students for joining. So I began this research several years ago at the time when this technology was newly emerging and a hot topic. And it originated as a simple curiosity in questioning the spatial impacts of a new technology, and with a seemingly simple and fairly broad question posed on the front cover of the book. The answer to this question has since taken on a life of its own, expanding to not only encompass research into a new mobility technology, but also into transportation's relationship to all of the complex and layered urban systems, infrastructures, spaces, cultures, and histories, and societal ambitions that emerge from the question of how we choose to move around in cities, the mobility technologies and choices that we use as a society to do so, and the spatial futures and built environments that result from those choices. While the idea of mobility automation had been dreamed since as early as the mid-20th century, as shown in the previous image, the reality of the technology's possibilities has accelerated really since the turn of this century, culminating in 2018 when Waymo, which is a subsidiary of Google, launched commercial services in Arizona. And by 2023, commercial operations had commenced in various cities in this nation. This past March even, New York announced that it was open for business, putting us on a track for a future in which driverless vehicles begin to operate in many major city centers. So I actually got to test ride one of these last spring in San Francisco, and Waymo was already running full commercial service in several cities on the West Coast. But before we get too carried away with this tantalizing future, though, I want to frame this discussion with this law called Amar's law, which is an observation useful for technological forecasting that asserts that we, as a society, we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate its effect in the long run. This law is closely tied to what is called the Gartner hype cycle for emerging technologies, which delineates the maturity, adoption, and social effect of modern-day technologies on our society, and expresses how we tend to overestimate via mass media hype the effect of a technology trigger in the short term, then kind of get disillusioned with it as it hits some technological walls and challenges. I would say we're kind of in this phase now, starting to move out of it. And with negative press, which AVs certainly have had their fair share of, which trends us then to kind of really underestimate its effect in the long run. Certainly, there's been a lot of discussion of AVs and their short-term technological safety, legal, regulatory, and ethical issues, and these are all really important questions to answer. But in the background, meanwhile, huge tech corporations have continued to develop the tech and roll it out nationally, while the media has moved on to debate other technological triggers like AI, VR, things like that. However, the long-term effects of autonomous vehicles, particularly on the spatial, urban, and built environments of our cities, has been very much under-discussed and underestimated. That, for me, is the important question that I often find missing in these conversations. What will their effect on urbanism, on our transportation networks, on design and planning, on infrastructure be? As often happens with new technological disruptions, the answer to this question often depends on who you ask. On the one side, technology skeptics kind of answer with a dystopian fear that the proliferation of empty zombie cars will increase congestion and traffic on our streets. They'll circle the block looking for their next passenger. On the other side, technology utopists imagine a kind of dream, a utopian dream in which the technology will drastically change the way we live and move around. But what must be crucially highlighted, however, is the amount of uncertainty that is really yet unknown with this unfolding future. Firstly, will they be majority gasoline or electric? They're assumed by many to automatically be electric, but that's not necessarily the case. Will they still require a measure of human oversight, or will full automation be achieved? Today, the technology stands at level 4, still requiring human override. Meanwhile, the elusive dream of a truly driverless experience that is able to operate unencumbered without any geographic limits remains just right out of reach. Will the vehicle ownership model remain majority private, or will we be able to transition to fleet ownership by transportation companies? In the US, a staggering 92% of households own at least one vehicle. And nearly a quarter of all those households own 3 or more cars. With the future of mobility, there is a potential to rethink the way we think about mobility from one of individual ownership to one where it's consumed as a service, where you pay for each ride as a subscription, releasing households of the need to own and park the vehicles themselves. So removing the driver in mobility as a service also means removing the cost of driving labor. It's estimated that over 60% of the average cost per passenger miles traveled for a private ride-hailed company is attributed to driver costs. Eliminating these costs means that the cost of consuming mobility as a service becomes comparable to the cost of owning a car, and therefore invites bigger picture questions of where these financial gains could and should be put towards. In either case of ownership model, though, will vehicles remain majority single occupancy, or will we be able to transition to a majority multi-occupancy vehicle model? And in particular, with respect to this question of occupancy, how many people will AVs be designed to carry? How many people should they carry? AVs present an opportunity to revisit the design of the vehicle and therefore the amount of space they cumulatively take up in cities. Many of you might be familiar with this photograph, which illustrates the amount of physical space in a city that each mobility mode takes up relative to the number of passengers they carry. The single occupant car, of course, consuming far more footprint, while their transit counterparts move people much more efficiently and sustainably. This mobility choice between single and multi-occupancy is not a contemporary phenomenon, but actually has existed with the invention of each successive mobility technologies of their respective eras. From when we still used horsepower all the way to electrification and the invention of the combustion engine. And these choices, this historic push and pull between, has greatly influenced the way our urban form, our urban infrastructure, our urban patterns, and our urban environments have evolved, certainly in the US and in many other nations' histories. What will the effect of driverless technology be on these behavioral choices and the design and planning choices that can emerge from them? So, collectively listed, we realize then that even with the introduction of AVs, if the future evolves into the path delineated on the left, it's essentially the same way we use cars today. Gasoline powered, requiring human oversight, majority privately owned single occupant vehicles. What comes with the convenience of the personal automobile goes also hand in hand with documented fundamental root causes of many of the environmental, economic, cultural, spatial, and infrastructural issues facing our cities today. Negative externalities from the 20th century automobile that generated traffic congestion and pollution, urban sprawl, a shrunken public realm for the pedestrian, and monofunctional infrastructures in our cities. The gasoline car, the electric car, the automated car still imparts the same physical negative externalities on urban space if they end up being used in the same way. So the question that remains is, what future do we aspire towards? And if we do aspire towards the best case scenario on the right, what are the technological design and planning tools that we can use to get us to that point? And in particular, how do we think about AVs not only as a singular technology, but as a form of infrastructure, which will have a profound spatial effect on our cities, just as other transportation modes became foundational infrastructures for the design, form, and planning of cities in their respective eras and urban environments. So with the proliferation of AVs, what could these speculative urban futures result in? As a thought experiment, let's play some of this out. In scenario A, right, given the cultural and behavioral norms of majority single occupancy vehicles, the way we use them in this country, it's certainly easy to imagine a future in which the market innovations utilize AV tech to reinforce existing trends, even if the dream of full automation and full electrification is reached. This is also the potential scenario that may be likely if private OEM companies like Tesla and Ford were to realize their vision for an autonomous future in their bid to sell and replace current cars with the automated variety. What might this potential future result in? Perhaps an exacerbation of suburban sprawl that our cities are already facing today. And why would this be? Because passengers measure commute willingness by time rather than by distance. In a fully autonomous future scenario, AVs promise a future in which passengers are free to use their time productively. You can work, for example, instead of drive, and they can park themselves or be sent home, which saves more time during the daily commute, coupled with faster journey times because the technology has the ability to increase travel efficiency and platoon together. The incentives to commute and live farther and farther away from the urban core might increase significantly. If left unregulated, one could easily imagine a future in which AVs exacerbate the worst tendencies of urban sprawl into new rings of AV exurbs, sparking the construction of AV superhighways built to facilitate this extreme sprawl. Let's entertain scenario B, in which we move to a fleet ownership model of AVs, but they retain majority single occupancy. What might this potential future result in? So I argue in the book and in the research that this model might potentially cause the downfall of public transit in our cities. And the reason why is because this scenario is essentially how private ride-hailing models of transportation like Uber and Lyft actually function today. So private TNCs, transportation network companies, compete mainly with public transportation, walking and biking, drawing customers from these non-auto-based modes. They're only used in place of the personal automobile, mainly when parking is expensive or difficult to find. In other words, they're not taking miles away from the private vehicular use, but instead are adding more miles onto the road because they compete directly with users of public transit. Uber and Lyft aim to one day completely replace traditional fixed route services like public transit with on-demand and in the future driverless on-demand vehicles, with the bid to increase their mobility market shares and dramatically bring down costs with automation technology. Public transit may be the mode that suffers the most. Despite relatively constant economic growth in the past decade, and this is pre-COVID, Public transit ridership numbers took a nosedive in these 4 cities, as an example, around the year 2014, which is exactly the time when Uber and Lyft came to market, illustrating that as soon as passengers are able to reach an income threshold where they are able to afford private ride-sharing vehicles, they opt to do so over public transportation. Which leads us to our final scenario C, a hopeful best-case scenario in which fleets of driverless vehicles are used to shuttle passengers more efficiently through shared multi-occupancy transport. Might this lead us to a new transitopia in cities? How would this affect existing transit and transportation networks? Could AVs be used to support and work with these systems rather than compete with them? What spatial design futures for our cities and streets could this unlock? Can we use driverless technologies not to further reinforce our current status quo paradigms of mobility and the externalities that resulted from them, but instead rethink them through a whole new range of driverless shared mobility vehicles that could fill in mobility gaps, the first and last mile gap, for example, expand the geographic reach of our mobility services from the mini, 1 to 2 person flex shuttle, like the smart car, for example, that could cover transit deserts in cities, to larger vehicles that run on fixed routes. This is a scenario that really requires our public transportation agencies to be proactive about not only regulating, but utilizing this technology either in their own services, like bus and express buses, and possibly through public-private partnership models with private companies that run service in coordination with agencies who set fares and geographies, network geographies. And more so than just the service itself, how could this type of model of AV use expand transit-oriented development radiuses, increase density around fixed service lines or suburban park and rides, instead of the unconcentrated sprawl that private automobile use encouraged in our built environment? So given this potential best case scenario future, which I outlined, let's return to the question of what exactly the spatial opportunities are that come from the technological leap of automating our mobility. How does removing a driver from a vehicle actually change the way our cities can be designed? What are the technological tools that they can provide? We've talked about the first 4. I've touched on that a little bit already this evening. What we haven't discussed explicitly yet, but is possibly the most transformative, is the amount of land released from parking in cities. And along with the first 4 tools, the spatial effect that these cumulative impacts give us in reclaiming urban space for new uses. On average, it's estimated that automobiles spend 95% of their lifetime parked, vacant, and not in use. In the US, there are over 280 million vehicles owned. And it's estimated that there are 8 parking spots dedicated to storing each car that is owned. Nearly 1/4 of all households own 3 or more cars, demanding 24 spaces, including not just the spots at home, but the distributed lots and garages around cities required to store cars when you drive them somewhere. This results in cities in which the surface area dedicated to parking takes up on average 22%, almost 1/4 of urban centers. In some cities like Las Vegas or San Bernardino in California, this number reaches a staggering 32% and 49%, respectively. And when you incorporate not just the space required to store vehicles on parking lots and garages, but to street parking and the space required to move them as well, you start to understand that these spaces are the largest underutilized assets in our cities, and the scope and scale for which we can rethink the relationship between urban space and urban mobility. This starts with not only defining and measuring urban mobility through the number of people moved, rather than the number of cars moved, but also with revisiting not just the spatial, but the economic, political, and cultural choices that we have made in cities that have led us to the assumed right of the car to these spaces and the dependency on that automobile. The introduction of motorized transport saw the structuring and use of our public spaces be wrestled away from humans and pedestrians towards vehicles and motorways as its primary function. This space and its historical use has previously evolved not just for the movement of goods and people, but for spaces of conspicuous consumption, for commerce, for play. Of course, the history of streets is another lecture for another time, but even today, our streets serve far more vital, important uses, right? We think of our mobility infrastructures as the connective circulatory system of cities, moving people from point A to point B, and they serve that critical function for sure. But we often neglect to realize that they serve a far multitude of other complex and vital uses. Who has a right to our streets and their uses? The automated vehicle, the human, the environment? With automation, not only does the need for individualized parking disappear because you send your car home to park itself, or because you don't own a car anymore, but we can perhaps begin to rethink the hierarchy and social relationships that we took for granted and revisit the question, who and what has the right to use this space? How can we design our mobility infrastructure to encourage more democratic uses, encouraging shared right-of-ways that remove curbs and pavement differences to encourage use through implicit social negotiation rather than through hard and fast infrastructural design choices? Might AVs allow these street designs to be even more ubiquitous, given that they are actually, kind of hyper cautious? They're always going to stop for a pedestrian. They will always obey traffic laws. They'll never exceed a speed limit. How can we prevent the opposite from occurring? With policies and street design moves like bollards and railings cordoning off the street from pedestrians, or pedestrian overpasses that give the right to the street to the vehicle because pedestrians impede the efficient travel of AVs? And what are the design and policy choices that we can make when we as cities, societies, and citizens collectively answer that question differently? Using the tools of design, policy, activism, and tactical interventions to do so in even the most highly congested areas of cities, including right here in New York not too long ago. Spaces that used to be for cars only, but have now become vibrant, public, human-centered spaces that we enjoy today. How can we rethink even more ambitiously about reclaiming single-function highway infrastructures for blue-green systems, for people, for biodiversity? How can these infrastructural choices become a paradigmatic template for political willpower and coalition building, and an opportunity for cities to redefine the relationship between our mobility choices and our societal ambitions? Along with the topics that I've been discussing, these are the major urban spatial implications that a good portion of the book explores. Through typological design thinking and the multiple scales of our city that are intertwined and influenced by the mobility choices that we have made. The automobile and the space dedicated to parking and moving them has distinctly impacted these scales of our city. What could happen when that vehicle becomes automated? What are the possibilities for reclaimed urban space? What are the opportunities for pedestrians, natural systems, and densification with affordable housing or other valuable uses of land? Collated together, these multiple scales form a diverse toolkit of strategies to guide designers and planners as new technologies become adopted. Starting from the adaptive conversion of car-centric building types for parking garages or drive-through restaurants that have evolved around the specific dimensions, turning radii, queuing lines, and the storing of the car. From the land use and density transformations at the scale of the block, including the way our single-family zone blocks have evolved to cater to driveways and front-facing garages, to the way our urban superblocks are hierarchically structured, to the highways, streets, and intersections that facilitate their movement and their potential for transformation, adaptation, and conversion, and all the way to the larger transportation network planning of our cities. How can we consider driverless vehicles not just in a vacuum, affecting only individual transport or the automobile, but understand its relationship to our comprehensive mobility systems and networks, ranging from how we move in the first last mile, engaging micro-mobility options, all the way to long-distance commutes using autonomous rapid transit and driverless buses. Can we rethink the hierarchies of multimodal transportation, and how does this begin to set the metropolitan blueprint for densifying zoning and land use around multiple urban centers and high-density corridors that connect them, rather than continuing to expand in the outer peripheries through low-density form and segregated land uses? Can this become an exciting structural template for a city's inward densification and growth in its future eras? And importantly, this book outlines the critical policy and regulation guidelines that are needed to support and enable and unlock these bigger picture spatial opportunities. Critical transportation policies that can produce the economic, fiscal, and development incentives to spur these design transformations, paradigm shifts, and create the policy guide rails that will allow AVs to be used in the quote-unquote best case scenario. Many policy tools which we in fact already have today at our disposal to regulate our built environments so that the spatial costs to use a shared resource of urban space are redistributed more equitably and through financial levers. These are policy tools that also must be accompanied with larger design visioning for what the spatial future of our cities could ambitiously become. And when they aren't paired with this spatial visioning, they won't survive the political pressures of the status quo, which is what happened this past summer. This framework, grounded in the history of transportation and its relationship to urban form, which sets up the typological design and policy thinking, is what constitutes and structures book one of this 2-volume publication. They have the potential to set a blueprint for a paradigm shift that unlocks multiple scales of rethinking a city's built environments. The second paired volume what I called experience, addresses what I have lightly touched on and inferred on, and that is the role that language, media, and importantly, culture have played in shaping our mobility choices and the bottom-up experiences that those choices produce in our cities. When our last mobility disruptor, the automobile, arrived in cities, auto interest groups and corporations commenced a campaign to redefine the culture of our streets and who has a primary right to use them, deploying media advertisements, new terminology like jaywalking, which connotes an uneducated, quote unquote, person who does not know how to walk, quote unquote, correctly in modern automobile-filled streets, and their criminalization through the illegal use of the street by pedestrians through fines and laws. They ushered in our current era that secured the street's legal use right for the automobile. These promotional approaches were a key lever for which they influenced transportation policy, public opinion, and culture. This fight to define and redefine the correct use of urban space continues today, spurred by the technological catalyst of the driverless vehicle. In 2017, the car company Ford coined a new term called the pedestrian in order to protect their cars from distracted pedestrians, casting the blame of traffic fatalities onto the behavior of pedestrians rather than on cars and the new technology of AVs. Through history, what we see is that the innovators of new technologies often attempt to condition and alter human behavior around new technologies in order to facilitate the commercialization and acceptance of that technology into mainstream societal use. This defining and promotion of certain mobility cultures over others has been distinctly solidified in the cultural milieu of car-centric societies that celebrate the car as a quintessential form of home, identity, social class, privilege, desire, and self-determination, culminating in rites of passage ranging from the obtaining of one's driver's license to auto shows and car clubs. And especially through Hollywood, using not just language and advertising, but cultural media, visioning, and imaginative world building to promote, celebrate, and perpetuate certain cultural assumptions over others. These forms of visioning, using socio-technical systems to imagine a new utopian future for our cities, planted the social ideals that if only every household had a car, and if only our cities' built environments were designed to cater to that technology, then the city of the future could be realized, eventually inspiring many in the years after to actualize these ideas to come to pass. This type of visioning has been equally embraced by the architecture and design disciplines in our histories, which utilized and depended on the new technology of the automobile to respond to the urbanization issues of their times, in order to spatially and socially reorder urban form, mobility, infrastructure, lifestyle, and social order into different projective visions for the future. Altogether, these various top-down visions have been widely influential in the development of urban planning in cities around the world, often in unintended ways, and bereft of their original social ideas, but enabled by the embrace of the automobile, they contributed to the design of modernist public housing typologies, superblock typologies, infrastructural expansion, and suburban development models, of which many are, of course, critiqued today for their failures, and of which we are grappling with their unintended spatial and social and environmental impacts. Today, we see this socio-technological utopian vision continue, driven by 21st century techno-capitalists that again use the latest new smart technologies, new green technologies, and new mobility technologies like the driverless vehicle to enable their visions to come to fruition. They demonstrate a singular belief in the technology of their idealized cities to quote unquote solve 21st century urbanization. Combined with the enormous amount of unchecked capital, economic, and political support behind them, these top-down visions are ripe for not only replicating, but expanding to a far greater degree the environmental, social, and spatial pitfalls of the implemented urban utopias that came before them, that neglected the human and cultural experience of urban space at the expense of technological efficiencies. So, in sharp critique of these models of top-down visioning, but also with the understanding that instigating a paradigm shift comes with alternative forms of media, language, and visioning, Volume 2 of the book pairs this framework with the experiential medium of the graphic novel. The graphic novel is used to combat the historic celebration of the car in the cultural imaginary, offering an alternative, bottom-up, human-centered view of how new technologies can be used to improve the public realm and health of our cities. And it offers an alternative story that might be far more accessible to the public in order to convince them that alternatives to car culture could exist, and that there is hope to transition from the utopias of today to a transitopia of tomorrow. It argues that it is through the eyes of the everyday urban dweller that we must imagine an urban environment that evolves more positively for the human rather than alienating us, something that technology has historically brought upon the city. Each of these narratives represent varying incomes, demographics, and family structures, exploring distinctly different experiences of the automation paradigm shift that could occur in the near future, exploring these topics under various subtopics that automation technology could spark. And collated together, they demonstrate a wide capacity for a new automated transportation network to serve a variety of distinctive mobility needs, ranging from the experience of a prototypical nuclear family in the suburbs, in which mobility as a service and microshuttles work to support long-distance transit, freeing households of car ownership and the opportunities for densification that might bring, to roommates living in the urban core, in which their commute and travel experiences are changed, utilizing a far more diverse range of mobility choices for their varied needs and the transformed streets that they encounter along the way, to larger infrastructural transformations that are used to address and reverse the historic inequities that highways had previously levied onto our communities and neighborhoods, to shifts in labor and service, exploring the new service jobs that might evolve with automation, and to exploring not just their impact on urban space, but the end-to-end experience of mobility service, from the moment you decide what mode of transportation to take in a city, to the technology and the apps that you interact with to get to where you need to go, and the behavioral and cultural impacts that they have on your daily life. So I'll conclude this last section of the lecture. I'll conclude with the last section of this lecture by revisiting the question I asked at the top. The answer to this question has surfaced a variety of other embedded questions and themes. And while it is a book about driverless vehicles, it's really also a book about our broader transportation choices and the relationship between our mobility and urbanization, and our mobility and our societal ambitions. And while it is a book about new mobility technologies, it's also a book about the relationship our technologies have had on our culture, cities, and urban form, and what alternative visions and new methods for projecting alternative futures can we then use to incite design policy and behavioral actions today to achieve those futures. And it's a book which I think holds a lot of lessons for the future of cities, major applications and principles, not just for autonomous vehicles, but for how we should be thinking about any new technological disruptors landing in our cities, whether that's artificial intelligence, virtual reality, or future new technologies yet unseen. These are the bigger picture themes that I will end this lecture on. Firstly, that we must establish what the spatial principles, values, and goals that we collectively value and aspire towards as cities, as citizens, as stakeholders, and in the case of autonomous vehicles, as mobility consumers. Only by establishing these goals first can then any new technologies be used as a tool to achieve them. And make no mistake, technology is only a tool. Driverless vehicles are not a silver bullet. Misrepresenting tools as solutions is dangerous, especially because the language around driverless vehicles and any new technology innovation characterizes it as smart, intelligent, or autonomous, or worthy of a human user's trust in relinquishing control to that relinquishing control of self-directed decisions to its hardwares and softwares. But any technology is only as smart as the humans who designed it, subject just as much to the human flaws, decisions, biases, preferences, and inputs as any other low-tech or high-tech tool. And it is the way we use these tools toward these larger spatial goals and values that is up to us to define ourselves. Next, that even as we embrace the benefits that new technologies can bring, we must also acknowledge and be vigilant to the negative externalities that they can cause. Many of these we are already seeing unfold before us in cities. For example, the fact that mobility companies like Uber and Lyft actually increase congestion and vehicle miles traveled despite their claims otherwise, or the documented impacts to the public realm, pedestrians, sidewalks of cities that have allowed micro-mobility technologies to proliferate unchecked or when they're unregulated. And of course, even to the technology's supposed greatest advantage, the electrification of our mobility, that have already begun to cause negative environmental and territorial impacts elsewhere in the world, including the large-scale extraction and mining of cobalt and lithium that are needed to produce the batteries that EVs and AVs run on. and that we need to be thinking bigger picture about environmental health, including not just electrification and the embodied carbon that comes from the mobility choices and technologies that we make, but to the metropolitan urban structuring that results from prioritizing certain transportation choices over others. How can we move people while consuming far less energy, and what urban patterns and structures best facilitate those relationships? It's a book that also calls on multiple disciplines to avoid the disciplinary siloing that, in the case of our past era's mobility technologies, tore apart the design of our streets and their uses in our recent history. It asks, what disciplinary role should we be playing in determining how new technologies impact our societies? It calls for AV innovators to step back for a brief moment from solving technological issues and to consider how the vehicle design, business, and service models they are investing in will impact not only mobility systems, but urban space. It's a call for urban planners, policymakers, and public officials to put AV regulatory guidelines and frameworks in place before they have proliferated into mass market and it becomes too late to rein in any of these negative externalities. And it's a call to the urban citizen who contributes to the evolution of our transportation systems in the everyday mobility, daily mobility choices that we make, to consider how our own transportation choices and behaviors shape urban space, culture, and the evolution of cities. And it's a call for designers, architects, and engineers to shape urban infrastructure and form to facilitate human-centric, multimodal, and publicly vibrant spaces over others like parking or highways. It's also a warning against designing and planning infrastructure around the limitations and efficiencies of a singular technology. Streets being designed only through the lens of the movement of cars results in the proliferation of highways, rather than streets being designed and understood as a confluence of form, placemaking, and movement in synergy. It's a call to ensure that new technologies first benefit those most in need, and to rebalance and redistribute mobility resources and urban space more equitably. In the US, for example, a sizable percentage of the use right of our public streets through street parking is essentially allocated to storing private cars. But this is subsidized by a larger public tax base, many of which whom do not drive. And this fact, along with a variety of other cultural, economic kind of acceptances or assumptions, is what causes the percentage income spent on transportation to actually decrease in percentage as your transportation, as your income increases. And the inverse happens in Europe because there are the policies, regulations, and rules to ensure that the percentages are more equitably distributed. How do we ensure that the cost to access new technologies are accessible and affordable to those populations that are often the last to receive their benefits? And that new technologies are not used to exacerbate existing economic and spatial inequalities, and rather used to address them. And it's a really important call to not ignore new technologies, as technology skeptics or naysayers are wont to do. Because if we do, these technology decisions that impact the future of our built environments will continue to be made by the technology companies that are using this technology to maximize market share and profit. We can't ignore AVs, allowing them to proliferate unregulated and potentially bereft of any consideration of the common good, or we can utilize them and the media attention, innovative minds, and the large quantities of funding and investment that they bring as tools in the fight to reclaim our city's public space. These are the results of political and economic decisions that not only encourage certain modes of operation, but also how we view and define them. How can we collectively wrestle back the vision of our future cities from those deploying advertising and media to advance private interests? How can we tackle the cultural paradigms that prioritize certain mobility cultures over others? How can we take control of the language and narrative surrounding these issues to make our cities better places for humans and for the environment? And how can alternative forms of design visioning, world building, and language be used to project alternative futures and new paradigm shifts to the status quo? And this leads me to my final point, which is that changing the way you move around the city and the technologies that you use to do so fundamentally changes the type of city that you get. Urban transport can never be considered independently from urban form and land use, as these two cities on opposite extremes of this kind of spectrum, LA and Hong Kong, demonstrate. And that really places transportation, and therefore the choices we make about how we want to move around cities, in the center of the future evolution of them. How can driverless technologies be used as a tool in these goals and futures that we collectively determine? And above all, how can we approach this future with an equal dose of optimism and realism, understanding how past advances in mobility technologies have impacted cities and societies? We can't blindly ignore those pitfalls, nor naively embrace the utopias that they also present, and any other future technological catalysts present. Instead, we have to tackle both the perils and the opportunities brought on by new innovations head on in order to shape a collective urban future forefronted by the public good. So it's with this empowered spirit that I hope you leave this lecture and this book with a desire to use any incoming technological tools, including driverless vehicles, to create a better future city. Thank you very much. So I'd like to invite and thank my colleague Marcella for moderating.
Here. Yeah. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Evan, for such an amazing journey. I think, first of all, congratulations on such an amazing book and work, and thanks for sharing it with us tonight. I think was, again, an amazing journey that I think took us to a lot of layers, a lot of possibilities of how we envision the future, and also how do we envision the future collectively. And also how do we interpret the role of technology and how you said it at the beginning, the effect of technology and how technology, again, it's only a tool, but how do we begin to develop technology along with how do we see society and the development of our collective future. So I think one of the key aspects is the book introduces us into a very provocative exploration of autonomous vehicle. I think the word provocation, I think the way in which also the book is structured, talk us about the fact that on the one hand, I think the first book talks about the framework in terms of how we begin to rethink urban forms in different scales and forms. So addressing, the single, let's say the larger urban networks, the single block or the single neighborhood up to the scale of the building and how this might affect typologies. I think on the second layer also how these start to impact our life on a daily basis. So the experience, let's say the second book, talk us directly in terms of how, again, these things impact us more than what we think. Even though, we are there, we will get there, and even more, I think, in the future. So at the same time, I think the book starts to, again, link together the fact of how the autonomous vehicles will develop in the future might solve maybe some of the issues that we see right now in cities, like sprawling or environmental impact or congestion or other things, aging infrastructures. But at the same time, also the question, what might other issues or no issues, but again, I'm very positive, but what other effects, right, might this cause? And I think, so I think this gives the rise of blueprint for future cities and future development that again links together the way in which mobility is placed at the core of how we develop future cities. So the first question that I would like to ask is, are cities or people that work within cities or all of us ready for such a radical shift? And are policymakers, planners, and the public, all of us, equipped to leverage, because the technology is there, AVs, to can fully embrace its potential and effect? I think on the other end, are we as a society somehow ready to embrace such a change? And what are the social and cultural implications of that? And in terms of private car ownership to mobility as a service, and how this might shift our identity, lifestyle, and then also linking with issues of equity as well, as you talked about at the end. I know it's a long question, but I think we have to weave all these parameters together to begin to continue to speculate on the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Marcella. Thank you for also summing up the book in a very succinct way, even more succinct than my lecture. I think it's a great question. And I think the answer to that question depends on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. And I think it's important as designers and architects and planners to be optimists. Otherwise, what are we doing here, right? And we can use pessimism and dystopia to incite action. But for me, a common goal for a possible future that we can all get behind can possibly get you there even more or faster. So for me, I think we absolutely are ready, and for me, we actually need to be more ready, right? If you ask me, if you ask my take, I think a lot of this for me lands at the foot of regulatory agencies, because as we know, the market is driving these innovations, and what's unfortunate is designers and planners we don't have a seat at the table because we don't claim that seat, right? And so what happens is, and this happened with Uber and Lyft, they land on cities, they don't even ask for permission, then the externalities come, and then the cities say, okay, we got to do something, we got to put some regulations in place, but it's too late. It's too late in that once mass consumer has kind of accepted that technology and kind of integrated it, it's very hard to start to take quote unquote freedoms away, right? And so for me, it's actually it's a really important time that the book's coming out right when these AVs are now actually landing on cities, right? Instead of a few years ago when it was almost possible. And it's really a call for I think policymakers to put the guide rails in place so that we can be ready. And then it's a call for us collectively as designers, as citizens who make the choices that we make. And we were lucky, we live in a city in which we have these choices, right? But many people don't live in cities that there's a choice outside of the owning a private car and using that car, right? So are there things that you can do that can then like argue for or even create activism or lobby for things in which that can start to put the guide rails in so that we're not reinforcing the dystopias of yesteryear, right? I don't know if that answered.
Yes, I mean, I think we can keep going because I think and then of course we'll open up to the audience. I think I think what was very interesting, I think to see it's, we as a designer, urbanist and architects, I think the impact at the spatial level. So what are the spatial implications of such a change that in a way, we almost don't see it, but I think your book in a way draws it in a very kind of didactic way at the same time, right? That talks about, okay, what if we remove, even the parking space from our single family homes, right? Or we begin to, as you show, if we remove, it's about land use, right? If we remove everything that it's not about moving around, but actually to be of service of moving around, automatically we see how much space we have available. And the question, I think, for urban designers is, what do we do with that space? It's a crisis, I think, right? So what do we do with that space? Or how do we reimagine the public realm as a whole, where all these layers are together, infrastructures, mobility, of course, as a part of the infrastructure. So, and I think also was very provocative, the fact that in your book, you use LA as a kind of prompt, because of course, the legacy in terms of car-oriented city, that also in the imagery in which the city is built, how we see the city, even in the movies, right? It's a prompt that in a way links directly with the question at stake. So this, I think, the question, it's how do we envision, not how do we envision, but how do we begin slowly? Because that's what's happening right now, right? We are integrating slowly AVs into our cities, from logistics to services to single or collective. But how do we begin to also envision the capacity of scalability and applicability of AVs into different contexts, for instance, or different type of morphologies of cities? So I don't think, there is, of course, one might fit all, but maybe not, right? So I think it's a kind of a start to begin to envision that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, I think, the fine line you have to walk, right? And I think that's a great point, Marcella. The book, I think, for me, right, it's also, I brought up these urban utopias from the past 20th century, the ones that are even being implemented today. And there's a lot of a critique for me about how new technologies are being used by designers and planners as larger top-down frameworks, which I think we need to some degree, but they don't allow for the local bottom-up contextualities and for the local cultures and the local tendencies and behavioral cultures and you know, tendencies to evolve and start to use the technology in the ways that they need the most, right? And so that's why I use the lens of typological design thinking, right? So I'm not suggesting, I mean, you know, I get into using LA as an example, you know, a kind of prototype city, but I suggest typologically, what are the relationships that we can think about at multiple scales? And then as a toolkit, how can that start to unlock larger things, right? So it's not even a top-down framework. It's a critique on top-down framework to some degree. And then it's also paired with what are the experiences that drive those decisions, and how can we, the answers to that experience tell us as designers and architects what should go in the space that then gets reclaimed. And then to your note about Los Angeles, you know, I actually didn't bring it up in the lecture because of time, but it's a great, it's, for me, it was a way to, yeah, it was a distinct choice, not only because I went to school in the city. I lived there for almost a decade, and I have a fond kind of liking to the city, but also because, like you said, there is a distinct kind of cultural, you know, obsession and not cultural obsession, but a car culture that we today think of as associated with the city. But really, if you look at the city's history, has not always been that way. And there's been a really big legacy in recent years of moving and imagining how new technologies, particularly how public transportation can expand in the city. They've invested a lot into public transport with Measure M and Measure R, and there's a lot of societal ambition for rethinking what that city could be, given the current kind of associations that we associate with them. But to go back to your original question, I think LA is for me a prototype city, because then I can test these ideas, these typological kind of context-less ideas in real space and in real local conditions. So you get informed by the localities, but you can also apply this typological thinking more broadly. So it has the malleability to be able to do so. So it kind of walks that fine line between trying to do both in some sense.
Great. I have much more questions, but I would like to open up to the audience.
So thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. And of course, so I want to ask something that, of course, the topic is very important, right? As we've been discussing. But I wanted to ask a question about the book as an object. I think it's it's a very beautiful object, and the graphic novel, as Maria said in the beginning, it's very unique. So I wondered, and also we try to teach the students to be kind of more, especially in the thesis, to kind of get out of the box and try more experimental techniques of representation. So what drove, first of all, is this your drawings?
Yeah, and working with some really talented comic illustrators for characters. Yeah.
Okay, and so what drove you to kind of include this graphic novel, and what do you think it kind of brings in addition to the book or the story you want to convey?
Yeah. So I think, when I began this project, it was more of a conventional, okay, the answer to what it might become was a little more conventional, kind of following the lineage of, okay, what are the tools that architects and designers we are taught and have at our disposal, and how do we use those, right? And the more and more I kind of sat with the issue and with the research, the more it became apparent to me that maybe our tools are not always enough, right? And that there are other ways, and especially, when I started, capturing the research about how our previous urban utopias have been implemented and designed singularly, top down, and how maybe there can and should be new forms of representing our spaces and the experiences of them than just necessarily top down, architectural style drawings, which of course are embedded in the book, right? But they're kind of embedded in the stories, right? And so the stories are a way for me to one, kind of critique the way traditional architecture and urban design has carried forward technological progress in their work, critique that, but also a way for me to find a medium that actually can possibly communicate with a wider audience in ways that maybe our, closed loop system of academia and architecture for sure can often speak to these wider audiences. So it's a way for, I think it's a call to action for even anybody who's not familiar with reading a drawing to be able to read a experience and find themselves in that experience and then think about, okay, this is a possible future that doesn't exist yet, but it could exist if I start to make possibly some changes in the way I move around the city or lobby for change or things like this. So yeah, it was I think a really unique idea. I worked really hand in hand. I created a lot of the architectural style visualizations and worked hand in hand with an illustrator to kind of create the figures and things. So it was also a really fun, and it's a thing I would challenge, and I start to challenge actually, I think a lot of my students to do in their studio work is to find other ways to tell the story of your projects or your research that can start to talk to multiple stakeholders and multiple audiences. Yeah.
Thank you, Evan, for a really good lecture. But so I was wondering, incredible lecture, but the part that was becoming more interesting to me when you started to talk about the economics part of it towards the end. And I was wondering if in your research ever you looked at, let's say the curators or the creators of these technologies, Elon Musk's and the billionaires, and what their sort of vision at the city scale or what they bring in, what they envision in this. Are they imagining this being sort of a product they put out there and the city will evolve organically through urban designers, or can we invite them to the table? Are they inviting us to the table of discussion? I was just wondering if you looked at that aspect at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the last thing you said, which is they are the ones driving the conversations because they're the ones innovating on the technology. And we're not currently invited to the table, but we need to argue for our seat at the table. And I think if you look at, I think there's been a fascinating kind of shift in kind of utopian visioning into the hands today of like technological utopists. In the yesteryear, they were possibly in our field, and there was a lot of urban visions that resulted from them. And in these days, they're being driven by these kind of techno capitalists. And they are very interested in, obviously, one, using this technology to increase their profit and market shares, right? But they do so, I mean, if you look at the example that I had shown in the lecture, like in Los Angeles, Elon Musk started creating these tunnels all around the city so that he could facilitate driverless vehicles for Tesla owners only, right? As a way to surpass or to quote unquote solve the traffic congestion that the city is known for. And I think if you ask any transportation planner, that idea is public transit or should be public transit, right? It's something that we are very familiar with thinking about in new forms. Or I don't think you can necessarily reinvent the wheel, and I think a lot of these capitalists think like they're reinventing the wheel, but because they're not bringing design disciplines and planning disciplines to the table, we're not able to have that conversation in a mutual way. But and there's two things I want to bring up. One is I'm not meaning to vilify necessarily these actors. They're just acting for their interests. And two, I'm not anti-car, and that's another thing, which it might seem, right? But what I am is that cities need to find public-private partnerships that can incentivize multiple actors to, achieve the collective outcomes that we determine together, right? We can use the funding and the economics that these innovators bring, right? And they bring all the funding. That's what they bring. They bring the bright minds, the innovations that are driving this technology. That's why they are the seat at the table, because they're the only ones doing this, right? Our public agencies aren't, designers and planners aren't. So how can we find ways to incentivize their services, but also put them in pursuit of a larger goal that then we can define? And then on the note of cars, right? I'm not anti-car. What I am is I'm anti-car dependency, meaning where using a car is the only choice that you have because the market and the city and the urban environment has only given you that one choice, right? And there are many trips in which a car is perfectly suitable for that trip, right? And there are many trips that the car is not the best use of urban space, particularly for long distances where you can start to shift people together in more efficient use of space, right? And it's aligning the economic and financial incentives with the broader public good incentives so that all parties can kind of work toward a common goal, right? Rather than either not even having those conversations or reacting to each other or not even being in the same room, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Evan. Well, first of all, congratulations for really quite a phenomenal book. I had the opportunity, of course, to read it before I came to the lecture, and it is extremely rigorous and provocative in many ways that go, I think, beyond what you can present in a lecture. But the question that I have for you goes in relation to your book. Reminds me of something that Aldo Rossi once said, that everybody should write 2 books. One that's a manifesto, and one that is about a creative process, right? The architecture of the city, scientific autobiography. And you've actually given us both in one, right? On the one hand, you have a very rigorous manifesto positioning about the role of autonomous vehicles in shaping urban form. And on the other hand, you've given us a dream of how that could unfold in the city. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more, one, about this dialogue, and 2, if we did not live in a sort of a capitalist democracy, and you had full reign on what the future of autonomous vehicles, on how autonomous vehicles should shape urban form, for you, what would that future be, and where would the aesthetic project of that future, where would the aesthetic project where would the role of the architect engage that future?
Yeah, that's a great question, Felipe. Thank you, and it's also I think a question that I'll be pondering, in my next research projects, for sure. But I think it's a great comment about the dichotomy of the book, and it's not one I set out to do. I think it emerged from a more holistic kind of big picture understanding of the topic and the research. And, I think it's not necessarily just a history book where we're talking about our recent mobility technologies, right? It's not just a comic book that gives you an urban future, but maybe doesn't give you the tools to reach that urban future. It's about how do we take both, like you said, and leverage the possibilities and strengths of both to inform each other and to drive each other's actions, right? You need the larger big picture design visioning to tell us what the choices, transportation policies, the design decisions are in pursuit of, right? And you need possibly, and there's many other visions, and there's many other, there will be other architects and planners that create this vision, but this is one vision, right, that I'm putting on the table, and I think it's really important to plant that vision in the flag so that then we can react off of it and then decide if that's a vision that we collectively agree on and can then pursue, right? And then at the same time, if you don't pair this kind of utopian dream, you don't pair the kind of speculative world building with a deep understanding of the way technology and our culture and our society and our urban form has previously evolved. If you don't pair it with the more kind of technical, the more data-driven, the more metric-driven kind of understanding, then what you get is weaker, I think, because it's my dream and it's somebody's dream, but what are the steps and tools to get us to that dream, right? And so I think it's super important that in the context of this topic and in the book, when they live together, the tools that it provides, both the tools, hopefully, and both the vision that inform each other. And as for, sorry, your second question, which was, think about, if, let's say culture, let's say like the kind of socioeconomic system was tabula rasa, right? I think that's a minefield of a question, certainly. And it's one I haven't really thought about, actually, because for me, my answer to that, I think, is thinking about, again, the kind of techno-utopias that are being designed today. And for me, like there's a reaction against that. A lot of those, that's what's happening today, right? Is with a lot like Masdar City, with Toyota Woven City, with the Line. It's these techno-utopists and the architects that they hire, taking a vision for a technology or a way of living and planting it tabula rasa, right, in the middle of the desert, which we know is not contextless, but in a kind of like human-centered sense, it's contextless, right? Masdar City, same thing. Neom City, all these urban utopias you saw, starting from like Corbusier had an obsession with, erasing and starting anew. And I think for me, there's a little bit of a danger to that, because we know that technologies, they don't like, we can't start from scratch. The society that we have is the society we have, and the cities we have are the cities we have, and the problems we have are the problems we have. And so can we find a way to think about the opportunities that new technologies and react them to the realities of on the ground? For me, it's there's a warning sign, and there's a little bit of a it's not a exercise that for me is useful to think about something in absent space or in contextless space. And it's a critique on, I think, the visionists that do it in that way. And that's why I use typological thinking that is rooted in the city of Los Angeles. And that's why I use the experience of the human as a way to scale up, perhaps.
Oh, Tom Darvis had a question.
Hi, thank you, Evan. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you for really an amazing lecture, and even more so an enduring book that's not only important but valuable to assess the potential impact of these technologies. I think there's some cultural and political dimensions that you bring up that I'd like to just underscore a little bit. I think in particular in the American context, the car, for even back to Frank Lloyd Wright arguing for the Broadacre City, the car has been associated with individualism and the mobility of freedom, in a sense that the car has had a history that is deeply anti-urban, and it's one of the protagonists, and you can blame for suburbia and for sprawl. And we use the terms sort of car-centric, and in the lecture, in the book, there's a kind of description between the kind of individual and then the collective forms of transport. And I think in the context of America, collective transport or public transport, for some reads as either socialism or even communism. And I think in the political landscape of America, there's a lot of power with the oil lobby, the car lobby. In the time that I've been in New York for 5+ years, a rail link to LGA Airport has been blocked. The congestion charge was thrown out for political motivations at the state level. And I think that you entered the lecture with a comparison of an aerial view of Los Angeles to Hong Kong, and I think that those are really excellent extremes to kind of raise the relationship, as you call it, between urban form and the model of transport. LA has 2.06 cars per person, and Hong Kong has 1 in 20 households has a car. And I think that extreme inversion, that there are 40 times as many cars per person, or 40 many cars per capita in LA versus Hong Kong, is not only alarming, but it suggests the scenario B that you bring up, which really alarms me, that the potential for AV technologies to actually exacerbate and increase urban sprawl by us watching amazing Zoom lectures and events while we're in an autonomous vehicle rather than the pain of driving. And you bring up some really interesting regulatory points about car ownership and the potential for more social and public streets and all the advantages of less car ownership, but I'm not sure how we regulate that. But I wonder if there's a paradox in some sense, and maybe this is, I'm getting to a question, of the reliance upon AV technologies, whether individual or collective, and I think there's a big difference between AV technologies in that sense of its impact on urban form. The paradox of the reliance on AV technology to fix the problems created by the technology of the petrol car. And what's the potential there in this sense to limit car ownership and in the future? What's the potential for the impact of AV technologies to be upon collective and public forms of transport because of how you highlight its impact upon urban form?
Yeah, I think that's Tom. That's the elephant in the room, which hopefully the elephant is in the book as well, but which is particularly in the American context, right? The notions of car culture are, what some may argue inescapable, and I certainly don't deny that. But when I did some digging in my research, I think what we find is that being told that this has been a campaign in history to promote, through motordom, through private interest groups, to promote a certain mobility culture over others, and that has won out, and that language has won out not only in playing out in our cities, but in the assumptions that we take for granted and that we assume in the way we think and talk about car ownership. So we assume that we chose car ownership because we like individuality, and certainly that I think is embedded, right? But not having a choice is not the same as not having a choice not to drive is not the same as choosing not to drive. And I think what you find, New York is a great example, for example, where when cities and urban environments start to shake up some of these assumptions that the right to street park is free and that the right to use our shared urban space is something that we collectively pay for, but only the car owners can benefit from, right? Or highways, right? The fact that a local community has to deal with the negative externalities of a highway, but the communities that can drive in are benefiting from them, right? We start to question some of those choices, then I think that's where the opportunity arises. And I don't think we have to fall into this kind of pitfall of thinking that because America, quote unquote, is a individualistic society, we will always be a pro-car society too. I think if you look at certain cities in which the transportation choices have been provided that can give you more possibilities, consumer kind of behavior starts to change. And I think the biggest question is, how do we get the economics? I mean, the thing is, I think collective change, if we are going to be pessimistic, it doesn't come from a kind of broader, maybe big picture, like, okay, I'm going to do this for the public good, but rather, how does this impact my wallet and how can this actually save me money, right? And so I think if we can get the economic incentives to align to kind of encourage mass consumer behavior to follow, then I don't think the cultural notions will get in the way. And I think that that's why automation is particularly exciting, because the cost, like I said in the lecture, of removing that driver makes mobility as a service, in its very forms, whether it's shared to individual, much more possible and comparable to owning a car, and that you could possibly not own a car and then release that land for all these other uses. Yeah.
So we can take a few more questions, a couple of more questions. I mean, Yeah, we have some
So,
time.
so beside all the very crucial layers that have been kind of unveiled through this conversation and through your presentation, along which the systemic issues that this book is touching upon with a very elegant touch, I will say, without having never condemning or kind of, but just putting a spotlight on the issues that this is kind of the surface of systemic issues that manage the global control of oil and all of those dynamics. I think it's also interesting the way, in some way, the warning, right? Is the fact of referring or using these new technologies doesn't mean that we are doing well or we will do well. So be careful, because we can, if we keep applying the same thinking process, production processes, and goals of hegemonies or whatever to this system, the situation will not change. We will still have the traffic, we will still have the same problem, but instead of being car driven by human, will be auto driven. So I think it's interesting your way of pointing attention on that. This is the opportunity that we have to change something, to act differently and think differently, so that the consequences of these actions will also create different spaces, different opportunities that hopefully will be a positive ones. But we are in front of a decision that we are at this point, perhaps we're already late to take, as some of the references to mask and all of that has been done tonight also reveal, but we can still do something and act differently, though, so that these changes are really leading in a different direction from an anthropological and social point of view.
Right. And thank you, Giovanni. And I think that's absolutely right, is that the book is really a kind of call to action in some ways. And it's also kind of awareness that if we stay on the path we are, the status quo, it's going to reinforce, like, basically the answer to whether you think it's going to be A, B, or C is how optimistic or pessimistic you're going to be, or how realistic you're going to be. And the current status quo of that of automobility, if nothing changes, is A or B, and particularly probably B, right? Which is the way the technology, you know, like Tesla and Ford, they want to sell you another car, but just automated. But probably what I'm imagining and what all science kind of hints towards is that the Uber and Lyft model is going to win out, and that we're going to consume mobility as a service, but that if you don't think about urban space and the relationship to mobility, you're going to continue the status quo, right, of more automobility. And so it's both, like you said, a warning sign, but also an opportunity. And I think, you know, I'm an eternal optimist, which is why I would write this book and why I hope to insert myself in a conversation that starts with you all tonight, about some of the choices that we can make to possibly switch to a future. I should also say that, you know, they're not mutually exclusive futures, the A, B, and C. You probably, what you're going to find is, like, A is gonna manifest itself more in the urban exurbs, like we've seen. C might be possible in the urban core, when we have the density and where you have maybe the kind of cultural urbanites to push for it, and B might be intertwined between, right? And these are complicated and overlapping. They're not as simple as maybe the way I tried to, you know, define it for you in this lecture. But it's, what's important is that we're aware of these things so that we can make the decisions and we can choose to make certain decisions that we have an understanding what those long-term spatial outcomes could be, right? Rather than just going with the flow, right? Which is what, you know, is happening now. Yeah.
Evan, thank you very much for the amazing presentation, and congratulations on a very timely book. I think this is an important thing to do right now. I have an observation. I'm curious. I want to poke your brain a little bit about this. In your presentation, you have an emphasis on the material aspects of this development: the car, the street, the buildings, the layouts of the city, and so on. But at the same time, when we're talking about automated driving, we're also talking about machine vision, machine learning, data collection, and so on and so forth. Like this whole layer of other technologies involved in this that also serve not only the purpose of making these cars more safe or anything, they also are data collectors at the same time, producing actually income for whoever is owning the car at the end of the day. So have you thought about this political, economical relationship between this automated car driving and all the like plethora of elements that come along with them, including ethics, for example, and so on? Yes, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. That I'm so happy you asked that question, and that's it's something that I actually talk about. It's a chapter in the book, and I just didn't have time to dig into it. It almost deserves another lecture. But there's 2 points I think that you bring up that are so critical. One, I talk about how in contemporary times, increasingly so, and I think that maybe this is something that's possibly more unique to our contemporary condition. Our physical space is slowly being overlaid with digital space, right? And that there is this kind of the usage of digital softwares or space to start to inflect on physical choices. We were already seeing that with the way new mobility technologies are playing themselves on streets. In I think it was 2017 or so. I'm sure you all have heard about this the app called Waze, right? WAZE, which is an app that tries to allow you to circumvent traffic, right? It's an Israeli app. It was really popular at the time in Israel, and now here. And on one day, and there was one day where the app went down, and the entire kind of urban space of the city went into chaos because it was so distinctly intertwined with the way the people and the drivers were using that app, that without the app, urban transportation was like completely upside down. And it served to kind of show how tightly intertwined that we rely on digital space or digital technology to move around in physical space. And I think there are new opportunities for digital space to start to put us on the track toward the larger goals that I'm trying to maybe put on the table, right? So, for example, I mean, we already see ourselves in small ways, even playing itself in cities like today, right? Like even the idea of like metering the sidewalk where you used to have physical meters, now you can do it through an app. The idea that you think about mobility not through a physical material, but as a service that your app will give you. It's a subscription model possibly, right? That starts to change the way we think about moving through space. And also there's possibilities for larger public goods, right? For example, there's this technology called transit signal priority, where a digital beacon in a bus, for example, when it approaches an intersection, it can actually signal the light to turn green for it to allow it to pass, right? And prioritizes more efficient movements. There's also technology called dynamic lane management, which actually rethinks the composition of our streets from hard infrastructure, where you have lanes or 3 lanes in this direction, 3 lanes in that direction, and that's the only choice you have because we've decided that. But perhaps our urban space can be a lot more digitally malleable. If there's more demand at certain times of day, we can convert some of those lanes to 4 or 5 in one direction, or lunchtime we can reduce all of to 1 or 2 lanes, and the rest of the space becomes publicly accessible, right? I think there are digital tools that we can use to start to implement physical change in cities. And then the second thing that you brought up, Matthias, which is critical that I hinted at, is data. And that is huge. That is a huge part of this conversation. And that is, I think, a big, worry or a concern is who has, obviously, and I know you in your work, you work a lot with data, is who has access to that data, and how can we make decisions based off of the access to that data? Right now, what happened with Uber and Lyft when they landed in cities, because they went kind of unencumbered, nobody was paying attention to what they were doing. Uber and Lyft, the model is not making money necessarily off of each of the rides. It's actually the data they collect and then the decisions they can make to start to shift consumer behavioral patterns based off of that data geographically, right? They're actually, each of the rides is kind of subsidized by the venture capitalists behind them. But this business model is in the data. And the issue is when cities actually started realizing that this was the most important thing is the data, of course, Uber and Lyft were much more, were completely unwilling to give it up, right? And to allow access. And so what happened was it took a lot of years. It took quite a while for us to begin to understand that Uber and Lyft actually were increasing traffic on streets through data because they was closed under walled gardens, right? So I think it's really important when it comes to data that, again, we think big picture. Of course, individual privacy is important, but can we put the guidelines and regulations in place so that when digital space starts to really impact physical space, and when mobility innovators are collecting this data, how can the cities have access to this data and use this data to start to create a public good conversation? And it's actually been tested already in certain cities. Los Angeles has this data specification called MDS, which they used, and so Los Angeles is, for all of its grievances, is actually quite on the forefront of a lot of these technologies. After Los Angeles realized that after Uber and Lyft come, data was the big issue. So before all these micro scooters and micro mobility bicycles came, they forced any mobility companies who wanted to operate to partake and share in this system called MDS, which forced them to share mobility data with the city so that the city could start to get a bigger picture and regulate it. And I think those are examples of what we should be doing in terms of the topic of data.
So
And
we want to
have time for one more question.
Maybe we want students or former students that have questions. Yes.
Sorry, not.
No, that's all right.
Sorry.
I don't want to be a buzzkiller, but from the private sector and practice, working with state DOTs, just in South Carolina yesterday, I was presenting a complete streets project and the public asked this question too many times: why do we need sidewalks? And to me, the question of why do we need sidewalks is like, why do we need power lines, right? It's essential infrastructure to move us from point A to point B. But in the mentality of people in a lot of communities, and we don't even have to go to the south or the west. I mean, it's right here in like the edges of the city where it's much more car oriented. It's very discouraging to continuously push this new vision for the future while a lot of the residents and people push back so bad. So, but I find all your ideas and your takes very inspiring. So I would like to pick your brain, and maybe that helps the audience, the students. If you have another bit of inspiring information after all this research and all the work that you've conducted, how can we kind of keep pushing that from the state DOTs to fund this type of things and to, in spite of sometimes political pushback, to keep moving forward?
So one is, of course, to be an eternal optimist and to not lose that energy. But I'll use an example that happened here in New York City and that didn't happen with congestion pricing and failed to happen, that I think can overcome some of the, like, let's say, NIMBYs that you often encounter, right, when you're trying to impact change at this scale. The first is when you looked at, when I showed the examples of what DOT Commissioner Jeanette Sadiq-Khan did during New York, during the Bloomberg administration, was those street transformations, right? And what happened with congestion pricing in London and Stockholm was that they were selling the city and the citizens actually were using those ideas, or like testing the idea that we could reclaim our streets or that we should price movement, right, and redistribute more equitably as tactical interventions, right? They're quote unquote initially billed as temporary, right? Because you have absolutely this huge population that is like, how can you remove my free parking? How can you take away another lane from the street when it's already congested for people, right? No, of course not. I don't want this in my neighborhood, right? Because they don't, I think, and this is where the design vision is so important. So what they did was they build these things as temporary and reversible, and they put these as like, temporary things, and then when they went out into the world, they're temporary. So people were like, okay, well, if I don't like it, at least it's gone in a few weeks or whatever. And suddenly what they realized was, after using that space and after kind of a few minor behavioral adjustments, were okay, like I can't park here, but what do I gain instead? I gain this amazing public space, right? I don't get hit by a car or whatever, right? Or suddenly the congestion is far less in Stockholm, right? And then they took the temporary thing away and brought back what it was, especially in congestion pricing. And suddenly the urban citizens were clamoring for it to be brought back, right? Which is that, oh, okay, the vision, when it gets manifested on the ground, I think really starts to convince people. And I think that's what didn't happen with congestion pricing here in the city. Is it was billed as permanent and a final decision, and then there was no larger vision of what it could be. And so I think you know, part of it is being optimist, part of it is the importance of design visioning, and part of it is the importance of certain strategy rollouts that can start to massage and get public opinion on your side. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone, for attending tonight. Congratulations again. And there are some books outside.
And before you go, well, first of all, thank you, Evan, for this amazing presentation, for your 2 books within 1 book or 1 book within 2 books, and for the public, for your comments that has been also very inspiring and provoking some reflections. Thank you, Marcella, and all of you today. But we want to conclude this special event with a special ending. And I would like to invite your students to join you on stage. They have a surprise for you. Yoo-hoo! We have the wonderful students, the best students of New York City. This is, you know, telling about you as a professor.
And actually, not to do a promo, but we're doing an exhibition of the book that's going to be out in spring. And this is the team right now. We're working hard at it. So next semester, I'll be congratulating you guys for all your work. Thank you.
Thank you.